just starting to get to the point where people are noticing. It's going to get worse. It's going to get more and more obvious, and it's going to get more and more difficult. And I would say, like, the dust storm in Springfield is not the sort of thing you want to look out for. But droughts and 1 year of drought and 1 year of flood, or 5 years of drought and 5 years of flood, that's going to be more common, I think. And that's what really bites. That's what really causes a lot of disruption. So I'm not an optimist about either side of this picture. I think it's going to get worse, and I wish we could figure out some way to decide that we were going to stop it.
Climate scientist Michael Tobis returns to the Plutopia podcast as we discuss the current state of climate change. We look at the good, the bad, the ugly, and the terrifying aspects of our climate dilemma.
So we're here to talk about, I think primarily because since Michael is, among many other things, a climate scientist, we tend to talk about climate when Michael shows up.
And recovering climate scientists. Recovering climate.
Yeah, but you're still paying attention. I know you are. So what do you think? Are we going to be okay?
Are we going to be okay? My official answer to that question is that is not something to predict. That is something to decide. That's my official answer. I always give that answer.
That's a great answer.
Very good.
It's like, if you say, well, should I go to the hardware store? You don't predict whether you're going to the hardware store. You decide whether you're going to the hardware store, right? I can put it off till tomorrow. No, I better go today. These are decisions. So are we going to be all right? Well, we could be if we got it together to decide to be all right. The trouble is, it doesn't look like we're put together in such a way that we can make the decision. So when I actually am forced to predict whether we'll be all right instead of decide, I don't think things are going very well right now. There's a lot more awareness than there was. I think people are starting to see that this is real and this is not just a joke. But it will take a lot of cooperative effort from the whole world, and the world is not getting better at cooperating as far as I can see. So,
well, it seems to me that we would have to kind of change the operating framework, the assumptions that have become so common, especially assumptions. I mean, I hate to say that capitalism is bad, because I think capitalism can vary from good to bad depending on how it's practiced. I mean, kind of the idea of operating for some kind of profit can make sense, but if you become too extractive, and if you become so consumed with the process of making money that you exclude other priorities, including priorities that may be life or death priorities for the human race, then capitalism has become too greedy, too excessive, and probably should be scaled back. Because I don't really think of myself as being anti-capitalist, because I can imagine a way of operating where people could have some degree of capitalist endeavor. But I don't know. I mean, I think it has to be less competitive and more cooperative.
You could look at it that way. I used to look at it that way a lot. I used to think, well, the culture has gotten away with us, and we're letting greed dominate over all the other things that are part of our lives. But we do want to have this freedom of action that is what makes the good things in capitalism work. We want people to be able to come up with their own ideas and pursue them. I think the problem is more that uh, you're doing damage and you're not being charged for it, right? The economists have this concept called externalities.
Yeah, externalizing costs.
So the damage that you do when you gas up your car is something that you don't pay for. It's something that 8 billion people on Earth all pay a little bit for, and however many billions of people are going to come after us and still suffer from the after effects. I don't know, maybe 100 billion people are splitting the cost of the damage that you're doing, whereas you get the benefit, you get to go to Whataburger and you get to get your burger. And that's fun. You get to do the thing you want to do. You get to get the thing you want to get. And if you add up over all the generations of the future, what that cost, it's probably going to be a lot more than you would be willing to pay to drive to get a burger.
Yeah.
It's probably a couple $1,000s worth of damage that you're doing, but it's not coming out of your pocket. It's coming out of the pocket of people who haven't even been born yet.
Or maybe it's hard to even assign it an economic cost.
And that is also true. That in the argument against what I'm saying is also there. It's really hard to assign it an economic cost because at some point you spew so much of this stuff into the air, you do so much damage that human life already becomes impossible or next to impossible, and then the cost is sort of infinite. But even thinking in those terms, we've got a situation where doing the wrong thing gives immediate benefits, and the immediate benefits to an individual, to the company that's producing it, to the consumer that's buying it, and the damages it does is to everybody, everywhere, now and in the future. And so the best thing to do, according to that sort of economic thinking, is to put a tax on it, right? Make it cost more, and raise that tax until the point where it starts to cause people not to do things. Now, there's reasons not to do that either, but the point is, and this is what I was thinking of because you were talking about the carbon capture industry,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a nice piece on 60 Minutes that you pointed me to, and it was fairly enthusiastic about these guys who have these gadgets that pull carbon dioxide out of the air and bury it in the ground. But they didn't say where the money was coming from, right?
You're talking about the money to fund
this
the
operation.
carbon sequestration.
Yeah, it's an expensive operation, and they didn't say who was paying for it. And nobody's out there saying, I want to, the 50 cents it took me to get to Whataburger, I would also like to contribute $5 to reverse the damage. Nobody's doing that. And a lot of people resist it really hard. We actually have a very modest carbon tax in Canada, and people resist it very hard. It's not popular.
So wasn't there an oil company rep saying, "Oh, we're gonna do it," but was a little vague on how it was going to be done?
Yeah. So my take on that is I don't care if it's the oil company that does it or somebody else that does it.
Sure.
The question is who's going to pay for it, and I think that's what the oil company was being vague about. Well, okay, if you do this, your gasoline's going to cost 3 times as much as anybody else's.
Yeah, because they'll externalize the cost.
So who's going to pay for it?
Well, recently I've been reading about the reversal of good intent by people who bought electric vehicles and are now saying that was a mistake because I can't do what I need to do because There are no charging stations available, especially in California. They did a study that said 25% of the free EV charging stations are not operative. They're broken and they're not being fixed. And people are starting to say, well, maybe this was a bad idea because no one seems to be out there really pushing enough to make these electric vehicles a reasonable choice.
They just really need really long extension cords.
Very long.
Well,
Yeah,
but
you laugh,
but
but
Joe Biden says that they're going to build charging stations all over the U.S. and that
Yeah,
there's some budget for that.
Gono doesn't really equate to today.
Yeah, yeah.
you laugh, but the suburban trains in Chicago all are running off of an overhead wire. So you could have designed a transportation system that was externally powered. It's not technically impossible. So yeah, it sounds funny to have a long extension cord, but effectively, that's what electric trains are.
Yeah, well, the Bay Area, has BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, which is electrical powered, and it only goes to certain neighborhoods. So if you're not in you're one of the chosen ones, then you're going to have to use some carbon producing vehicle to get there, or walk.
Well, we can have a whole conversation too about individual versus mass transit, because the decision to focus on individual automobiles versus buses and trains and so forth, forms of mass transit, was clearly made from lack of foresight and a mistake. I say clearly. There's, of course, an oil company. Those guys would say, no, it was great because we've got people burning through our fossil fuels and paying us tons of money for it. But it's just not sustainable. Well, and it's a mistake that we made, and it's hard to reverse now. So now we're talking about everybody driving an electric car instead of everybody driving a gasoline car. But that's still not that efficient.
Right. It's still, it uses up a lot of resources, and it covers the entire, vast areas with concrete, which is also something that makes for its own little heating problems. So, yeah, but here's where, the United States has become a very class society, very, very much rich people and poor people. And rich people don't want to get on the bus with poor people. And so it's less true in other countries, but in general, buses are for poor people, and there's not just the convenience of the car, but there's just sort of the staying away from all those problems thing. I missed a bus in Austin once. When I first got to Austin, I worked at the JJ Pickle, and I lived in Hyde Park, and there was a bus that ran once an hour to the Pickle. And I was new to Texas, and I didn't understand that the sun was trying to kill you.
It's a very efficient sun.
I missed the bus. I saw it go. I was like feet away from catching it, but he didn't stop for me. And so I was standing out at, I think it was Fall, and anyway, I was standing outside downtown in the heat, in the sun, and melting for about an hour. I remember this was the last time I tried to ride the bus in Austin. So
you think about that the wrong way. Texans just like to be ahead of the curve. So we were ahead of the curve in global warming. We got hot here before everybody else.
Before anybody else. And yeah. So it does seem to be getting hotter in Texas pretty fast, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty hot in the summertime. Last summer was what they call a scorcher.
Mm. Well, back to the carbon capture concept. Right. There's something about that really concerns me, because I grew up, my dad was in the oil and gas business, And
Okay,
those
so
companies had a way of storing things like propane and butane underground in salt domes. They would wash a big area out of a salt dome and shove all this stuff down there, and it's supposed to be, it's great. It's not up in the air anywhere unless you get a leak. They didn't realize that the leaks occur in things like the earth, like salt, which washes away. And there were some really nasty uh, accidents involving that kind of leakage. And I could just see that happening with these supposed carbon capture projects.
yeah,
What do
I'm
you
a
think?
little behind.
Is that
Yeah,
paranoia or?
no, it's absolutely a legitimate concern. Um, yeah, if we're going to pay private companies to bury carbon dioxide, um, and they fill the capacity of their reservoir, and if they say, well, if I put any more in here, it's going to start leaking, is it in their interest to report that? No, it's not. You're paying them to pump it into the earth. You, what you want to pay them to do is not let it out for 10,000 years. Really, what you want to do is sign a contract to say, I will pay you in 10,000 years if that carbon doesn't leak out.
Oh yeah, that'll work.
Yeah, so there's problems with that. There's logistical and financial problems with that. No one's going to sign that contract, but that's really what you want them to do. You want them to promise not to let the carbon out for thousands of years, and they're motivated. Corporations are always motivated to cheat. The thing on 60 Minutes did talk about um, mineralization. So there's some fraction of the carbon that attaches itself to the rock, and so that's not going to leak out, and that's sort of a special case. And if you get that going, basically at least half of the carbon you're going to pump down there is never going to come out. But that doesn't mean that none of it will ever come out. On the other hand, if a fraction of it does leak, you're still better off than if you had spewed all of it. So there's all sorts of complicated trade-offs that are hard to explain to the public. And unfortunately, the politics of it gets, in the end, the politicians are going to have to pull triggers on things that work. I have a little bit of a motto. It's like, it's not enough to do the right thing. You have to do the right thing right. And it's really easy to do these things wrong. And especially since, in this case, you're really talking about thousands of years. You're really talking about doing something that will last long enough that whatever leakage happens doesn't matter. And that's a very, very long time. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard to get that right.
And the reality is, these people that say, "Oh, we're going to keep it under there for 10,000 years," they're not going to be here in 10,000 years. They won't be here in 100 years. So as long as it lasts until they're retired and gotten
As
their
long as it
stock
lasts to their
options,
retirement.
then
Yeah,
everything's cool.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, I did see a talk about, basically it was about detecting leaks. And so it is a problem. It is a legit problem with these strategies. But really the most important thing to say about it is that it's not enough. You can't just keep going the way you've been going and then suck it all up and pump it in the ground. And that's because it takes energy to suck it all up and pump it into the ground. And it takes more energy to pull it out of the air than you get from putting it in the air.
If you were, oh, go ahead.
No, well, so it's not a winning proposition. In the end, you not only reduce the benefit of the carbon you emit, you actually have a negative net benefit. So you shouldn't have spewed it in the first place if your plan is to pull it back out.
What I was going to ask is, if you were boss of the world, how would you handle this? What would you have done right now to correct the problem?
If I was boss of the world, I would not have Russian troops in Ukraine for the first step. I mean, I really think Russia is at the core of a lot of these problems. So it's if you ask me what's going on in the world that I would fix, I'd fix that first.
Well, how do you connect the war in the Ukraine to climate change?
First of all, it's a big. The world is really trying to just keep its balance in this crazy situation.
Right.
So it doesn't have a lot of energy to deal with problems that are on a 20, 30, 50-year timescale, right? It's got stuff to deal with now. And so it's hard to motivate efforts. But there's also the fact that Russia is a petrostate, and you need all major economies to participate in decarbonizing. And if you have a big player that's not playing, that causes everybody else's motivations to shift. Right?
So Russia's really not doing anything to try to mitigate climate change.
I think Russia is not only not doing anything, I think Russia is a major player in confusing everybody about what's going on.
Yeah, they're trying to increase the flow of petrochemicals because there are disputes with Germany over the gas lines, and with all of their exporting of petrochemicals, is key to their economy.
And I've noticed, I saw a story out of Texas where the now radicalized state government is basically going to start discouraging investment in renewables and teaching kids in school that fossil fuels are great, and not just like suppress the teaching of the parts of earth science that are inconvenient, but to actually disinform the students about
and that wouldn't be probably just in Texas, but wherever you have the MAGA people.
Well, there's the MAGA
pretty
people
much in charge. I mean, what they're trying to do is kind of a great reversal. When they say make America great again, they mean they want to go back to the time when there was little regulation, when women were in their place and didn't vote, and minorities were fewer and didn't have any power or any access to power. I mean, they basically they want to go back to a time when we're white and Christian, and the people who are making the rules and the people who are saying how we're going to operate are the people who are benefiting from it, profiting from it, the billionaires.
Any place
We used to say millionaires, but now we say billionaires because
any
of
place that has a power structure that benefits from fossil fuels is tempted to do the same thing.
Exactly.
And certainly what you've described is a lot like what's going on in Russia.
Well, Russia is complicit. I mean, Russia had something to do with what's happening in the U.S. right now.
I think so.
Russia laid the groundwork for it.
So any place that there are, wealthy people who are benefiting from the status quo regarding fossil fuels, it's in their interest to get people all paranoid about it and tie it into all their other paranoid fantasies. And so this is why I'm sadly turning into a real pessimist. And I wasn't most of my life on this stuff. I was saying, there are technical solutions. We can do this. It will be expensive and difficult, but we can do it. And now I'm just seeing the political power of people who are happy with the way things are and don't really give a hoot about what will happen in 100 years. So and one of the things I like to tell people when I talk about climate is you ain't seen nothing yet. I like to say that every time. Until we stop emitting, things are going to get worse. And they get worse in a sort of a nonlinear way. As the temperature gets further and further from the baseline, the climate gets weirder, sort of faster. You start getting weather that you're not familiar with. So
Basically, instability, climate instability.
climate instability. It's going to be hard on it's going to be hard on agriculture. It's going to be hard on infrastructure. They just had a 2-foot snowfall in West Virginia yesterday in May. They'd never had more than 6 inches before. That was pretty weird. We had an ice storm here. The day we bought our house, we had an ice storm. It was a big wind and ice event, and we, nowadays you sign on a house, it's all online. So we owned the house and we couldn't get to it.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a
Pretty weird.
I'm a bit of a meteorology geek, and I follow a lot of these things. And the storms in the recent time have been just amazingly, out of scale of what we were used to. And that recent 70 vehicle pileup.
Oh, the dust storm in Illinois. Who
Yeah,
ever heard of a
yeah.
dust
And
storm in Illinois?
that happened next to where my sister lives, and I talked with her yesterday, and she said that had never happened. She'd been there for a long time, and all of a sudden, the climate it's gotten drier. There's droughts. Places
It was
used to be fertile, and these farmers are plowing their fields. Abnormal wind comes along and just creates a haboob, basically, which is a big dust storm.
was the first official dust storm warning in the history of Illinois. So go
Mhm.
figure.
We used to have
So
this in Texas all the time, where John and I grew up. We'd have huge dust
yeah,
storms
but you
come
don't
in.
expect that in
Call them a
Springfield.
duster.
Mhm.
Yeah, you don't expect it in Springfield, Illinois. And yeah, so on the one hand, there's always been weird weather, and you have to be careful about confirmation bias. You have to be careful about saying, okay, well, that was weird and it's climate change and that's the end of the story. Because, you know, there were always weird storms. I think I'm more concerned about floods and droughts and things that last a long time. But yeah, every time something really strange happens, you sit up and take notice. Um, and when it's really outside the norm, um, I still remember 2011 in Texas and all those fires. Um, that was outside the norm. If you looked at the history of Texas before that, there had never been anywhere near as dry as Somerset. And so I chalk that one up. Sometimes I say, okay, like don't get too excited about this. It's just bad weather. But that one I would have chalked up to climate change. So it's hard to say, right? It's hard to talk about an individual event and say, okay, that's part of this change.
Well, climate is not the same as weather, and meteorological events are not necessarily, but can be linked to climate change. And that's so the trick of it is, to kind of try to look at the trends and figure out, is climate getting more and more unstable? Is it getting worse and worse? Is it getting less and less manageable, for us?
But again, I want to say that you're just starting to get to the point where people are noticing. It's going to get worse. It's going to get more and more obvious, and it's going to get more and more difficult. And I would say like dust storm in Springfield is not the sort of thing you want to look out for, but droughts and 1 year of drought and 1 year of flood, or 5 years of drought and 5 years of flood, that's going to be more common, I think. And And that's what really bites. That's what really causes a lot of disruption. So yeah, I'm not an optimist about either side of this picture. I think it's going to get worse, and I wish we could figure out some way to decide that we were going to stop.
Well, it
And
strikes me that it's hard to get people to be really serious about it. And the people who are talking about the most serious about it, they may be doing like buying a Prius or something like that. They may be putting solar panels on their house, but we have to make radical changes to our lifestyle. And even if I do that, that's not going to have enough impact. It has to be like billionaires with lots of properties and big like corporations, big companies that have huge operations that are energy intensive, and that are chewing through
yeah,
resources.
we're probably going to, if we had, yeah, okay. So back to what would happen if I was king of the world. There would have to be a period of cutting back. There would have to be a period at this point where we were collectively spending less on ourselves. And that's not a big seller. In the long run, we could live pretty much the way we're living now if that's the way we wanted to live. But there's a huge expenditure in renewable energy that has to happen before that, and I don't think people understand the sheer scale of it, the amount of solar or wind or geothermal or whatever that has to happen. I don't think people understand because petroleum operations, and again, I think Texas is different than most places because you actually see them and you feel them around you. But most of the country, most of the world, petroleum is just something, it's like electricity. It magically comes out of a pump and you don't know where it comes from. And so people don't understand the scale of the energy industry, and they don't understand the amount of infrastructure that needs to be put up to replace all of it. And and you start putting up wind farms and there's local resistance. My brother-in-law was in the resistance to local. I mean, he's dyed in the wool Democrat, always for the people, But when windmills, when wind turbines start coming to his neck of the woods, he fought them.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my, well, it's, I could see how somebody wouldn't like it, right? It's this
Yeah,
going around and around and around, and it doesn't stop. It's always there. It's this big industrial thing.
because they cause cancer and it kill
Well,
birds.
he believes all that stuff, but uh, but you move to the hills of Wisconsin. You don't move there because you want to be in an industrial setting. You move there because you want to be somewhere peaceful and quiet.
Well, these MAGA folks that we've been talking about here in Texas, they are radically opposed to anything that even looks like good environmental practice. They really want to take the funding away from any kind of wind power, solar power, even recycling. I live in a small town outside of Austin,
Mm-hmm.
and we used to have a recycling place that the county put out, a big giant dumpster. You could bring your recyclables in there and then haul it away. And a Republican got elected to the county commissioners, and they closed it up immediately and said, sorry, we can't do that anymore. We have to pay for it, so tough. And that's kind of the way they approached the whole idea of
Mm-hmm.
being nice to the environment. It's like, well, as long as it doesn't cost us anything, it's okay. But if it's expensive, forget about it.
Well, and if it means that I have to set my thermostat on 78 or even 80 instead of 69, then I don't want to do it, or if it means that I have to start walking places instead of driving places, I don't want to do that. I mean, people just don't want to be they don't want to be inconvenienced. They can pay lip service to it, and they can find things that are sort of like symbolic representations of doing something, like recycling. I mean, when you put stuff in the recycling bin, you can feel good about that and think you're doing something for the environment. But do you know where that stuff is going to go? A lot of it doesn't really go into recycling. They collect it and they throw it in with the rest of the garbage.
Yeah, when the city of Madison initiated their recycling program, they called it Madison Pride. I lived in Madison at the time, and I remember like being really irked by it, because pride spells out people recycling in defense of the earth.
Oh,
And so that means, okay, I've kept my beer cans out of the trash, therefore I'm done. It's like, okay, now I don't have to do anything. Hey, I recycled my beer cans, I'm done. Um, it's hard to get across to people how big this is. And I hear you, John, about saying the way we live as individuals, but well, I'm a big government liberal living in Canada. I think the government has to be the motivator. I don't think people individually are going to rise to the occasion. I think you have to have incentives and disincentives that are increasingly large, and that will really change what decisions people make. Now, I don't think that we have to be uncomfortable. I don't think that it's going to be awful, but you're going to have to change what you're doing. So Quebec, the next province over, has us not allowing new construction to have fossil fuel heating. And as you can imagine, heating is a big deal up here.
New York just kept passed the same kind of legislation.
Yeah, it's New York has a similar climate. Parts of New York have a similar climate. It's really, really cold, and heat is really important. And so people are trying to install heat pumps that work in this climate. There's new tech that allows you to basically run a reversible heat pump and both heat and cool electrically, but it's just getting started. And I'm looking at my new old house and trying to figure out how that's going to work here, and keep telling my wife that we're going to lose our gas fireplace one of these days. And but there's things that are going to have to happen to my house in order for for us to be compliant. I can't really afford to do them without incentives, and I'm
Yeah.
going to wait for the incentives.
Yeah,
But
I have a heat pump and it's great. I mean, it works off of electricity, and
mhm.
electricity is expensive at times. But the problem is at a certain temperature, I've got this lecture from my heating and air conditioning guys that come and check out my systems. And they said, well, after it gets to a certain temperature, the heat pump is not going to work. When it gets too cold, you're going to have to push the switch that says emergency heating, which is, full
Right,
blown
right.
electrical heating.
We have to buy more expensive ones that work down here when it gets below zero. But they do exist.
Yeah, we never had to deal with that until our recent few ice storms and,
It all ties back in circles, doesn't it?
mhm.
Yeah. There is a beginning of an indication that February cold outbreaks are going to increase in the high plains in Texas. Um, there, there's sort of a bit of a trend. There's not much theory behind it, but it's happening. So
Well,
February
anybody
is
that
turning.
studies how systems work can see how this stuff works. The glaciers and ice caps are melting, which means the sea is rising, and it's making coastline real estate not livable anymore, and insurance companies are failing to write those policies. It's like one thing leads to another, to another, to another, and it's pretty depressing when you think about, how are we going to stop all this system from falling apart?
Well, it has to start. I think it has to start at the global international level. I didn't think the Paris Treaty had enough teeth in it to matter, and I think my prediction has panned out, and we're not really living up to it. But it has to start there. It has to start with everybody in the world agreeing that everybody in the world has to deal with this. And we're not thinking globally these days. And having a war in Europe doesn't help. That feeling of we're all in this together.
Yeah.
But we are. I mean, it's we're literally all in the same boat. We either sink or swim together. And so we should, my short answer to all of this is, let's think like a planet. Let's not think like individuals. Let's not think like countries. Let's think like a planet, because we've only got the one.
Yeah, I think a lot of the teeth that were shown in the climate accords were more like those joke teeth the kids would have at Halloween. They'd put them in and say, "Hey, look at my teeth," and then when no one's looking, the teeth are gone and they're back to their old ways.
Yep, yep. So I don't know what else to say. I guess I could tell you that there's a big El Nino coming, and that should scare the pants off of everybody.
Yeah. What will the effect of that be?
Well, it's different in different places. Globally, it means the year after the El Nino peaks at Christmas tends to be much warmer than previous years. So if this pans out the way it looks like it's going to pan out, 2024 will be the warmest year ever by a fairly wide margin. And what that does to the climate, we don't know, because it's never been that warm. So there's some question about things going wonky that we haven't seen. Eventually, things will go wonky that we didn't expect. Typically, it's, I believe, where you guys are, I believe a cool, wet winter is what you can expect. We expect a mild, wet winter. So you guys and us will have similar weather. It will be cooler than usual for you and warmer than usual for us and wetter than usual for both of us. Floods in California typically, terrible droughts in Australia, terrible heat in India are probably going to be the big stories.
When are we going to see the sea level rise to the point that Ron DeSantis is underwater?
Oh, don't you wish? Florida real estate's a really interesting story, isn't it? People are still buying it. And the 30-year time scale, which is what a mortgage is, it starts to look a little iffy. Miami's already having problems pumping the water out. And so yeah, it's Florida's a strange place in a number of ways.
I'm betting flood insurance is hard to get in Florida right now.
Flood insurance, hurricane insurance, yeah, it's just people have to wing it, I guess. But yeah, but as for literally taking out Miami, what's the time scale? I don't know.
I wonder what the insurance bill is at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, well, literally taking out Mar-a-Lago. I don't know when the sea will rise.
Now, there's one reason to root for climate change just for that part.
Yeah, well, like we'll root for the part that's going to hit Florida. No, I have friends in Florida. It's a strange place. I know it pretty well.
I mean, I think they're in terrible trouble. They're in terrible trouble, and they don't get it, and they're focused elsewhere. They're not even paying attention to it.
The city of Miami is aware, but they're aware on like a 10, 20-year time scale. They're basically trying to keep the place livable on a decadal time scale. But whether it'll still be there in 100 years,
Unlikely, right?
it's unlikely that that anything resembling the Miami we have now will be there. And I think a lot of property will be abandoned and ultimately taken over by fish. But what the time scale is, I mean, this is where we put on my actual climate scientist hat. The time scale is not super clear. We know that there's a big chunk of Antarctica that's going to fail. And we don't know when. We don't know how fast Greenland is going to take to fall apart.
And it probably won't be like one big quick thing. It's going to be kind of a gradual thing, right?
Yeah, death by 1,000 cuts.
On human timescales, it'll be gradual. It's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be a big flood that comes in. But on the time scale of mortgages and real estate, it could happen.
But there's also unintended consequences, like we talk about the sea level rising and some of these coastal cities being underwater. That also means those cities are filled with toxins that will
I wonder
be
about
leaked into the ocean, don't you
I
think?
wonder about that. The time that really hit me was when that big tsunami hit. You remember the big Christmas tsunami?
I do.
And
Boxing Day.
a lot of cities got like totaled, and you're thinking about, well, what happened to all the gasoline, all the solvents, all the cans of paint, all that went into the ocean. It's not coming back out. I wonder about that. I don't have a scientist hat answer on, but I will agree with you that that's something to scratch your head about.
Well, the big hurricane that devastated Houston wiped out a lot of petrochemical plants, and from what I could determine from my friends in Houston, the damage is ongoing because they keep saying, well, we got it under control, but there's all this stuff that was washed away, and all these tanks were destroyed. You know, even the Superfund sites down there were inundated, by the hurricane flood, and so it's just
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, it's scary to think about that. There's some consolation in knowing that there's always been a small amount of leakage of natural petroleum into the ocean, so it's not like totally unheard of, but there are all these man-made chemicals that are in the environment, and it's a thing that's probably even more irreversible than climate change. You let these chemicals out, they'll decay on their own time scale, but we don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're putting everybody in a bad mood. Maybe that's why we're all fighting with each other and all angry with each other. We're irritated by some chemicals that we've been ingesting without knowing it.
lately I hear all these stories about forever chemicals, things that don't degrade, don't go away. They're just here.
Well, unfortunately, carbon dioxide is the big one. It's if it was visible, I don't think we would do what we're doing. I mean, if you could actually see it coming out your tailpipe, maybe it'd be different.
Remember the fog, the smog that helped start some clean air activism because you could see it and breathe it, and suffer from it. But when it's not evident, then oh, there's nothing wrong. It's just
Yeah,
somebody else's problem.
it's an infrared fog, and our eyes can't see it. So yeah, I don't know. Let's talk about something happy. I like music. Music's good.
Have you heard anything you especially liked lately?
Oh, I'm in Canada. I just follow along at a distance. I I don't have any strong recommendations. I've been playing keyboards a lot, and my wife's taken up the harmonica, and we're trying to start a little blues band.
Yeah, well, Canada just lost a great folk singer, Gordon Lightfoot, and you know, he wasn't a mega star, but he did some great stuff.
And, well, not to speak ill of the recently passed, I was never a big Gordon Lightfoot fan myself, but
Is there a jazz scene in Canada?
there is actually. I mean, Oscar Peterson was from Toronto, so
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
you can't write off Canada altogether. Um, there is a jazz scene. I haven't really connected with it, but there is some jazz clubs in Montreal, and it's now a 3 hour drive away. It used to be a 2 hour drive away.
I
Um,
recall that there was this trucker thing that happened where it felt like MAGA was leaking into Canada.
it is. It is.
Is that still happening there?
Uh, well, there's a guy with a farm on my way to Ottawa that has a gigantic sign that says F Maple Leaf CK Trudeau, and these uh, these guys are out here.
You sure that wasn't from the previous Trudeau?
That was a long time ago, and back in those days, Canadians were polite. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, no, it is. It's definitely leaking up here. Uh, some of the cable carries Fox, and people are uh, people are vulnerable and to it in the same ways. And the head of the Conservative Party now is strictly playing by the Trump playbook.
Well, the good news is, Tucker Carlson is no longer at Fox, so he's applying for unemployment, I guess.
Oh, he'll get a job up
Oh,
here.
he may move to Canada.
Yeah, he can get a job up here.
Yeah,
It's
put him on the CBC. That'll work.
fertile territory. So yeah, I'm not a fountain of good news here. I don't know what to say.
There are moments when I just can't take it anymore and I have to watch something really stupid on television.
I've stopped reading the news. I can't handle it.
Yeah, I mean it can be rough. I can't stay away from it though. I've been paying attention to. I've been paying attention to politics, and occasionally we get good news. In Texas, we have a candidate who's just announced who is going to run against Ted Cruz, and his name is Colin Allred. He appears to be a really good candidate. He's in the House of Representatives now. And he's going to run against Cruz as probably the most viable candidate against Cruz that I have seen. So it's kind of hopeful, and there's signs of life in the Democratic Party here and there. There seems to be one of the things I liked best was to see how Joe Biden embraced his alter ego, Dark Brandon.
Well, you already passed the Texas politics litmus test because he's he was a football star, wasn't he?
Right, NFL, I think.
If you're a football star, you get a get out of jail free card immediately.
That's a pass. Okay.
And he was president of his high school class. What could be better than that?
That's pretty small town Texas. That'll get people to sit up and take notice.
He played football at Baylor. He went into the NFL and was a linebacker.
That's great. Yeah, that's perfect. That's just perfect.
And he is very well put together. I mean, he looks very professional. He doesn't come across as somebody who doesn't have his act together. Some people may think that I'm implying that about Beto, and they'd be correct. I think that it was unfortunate that Beto ran against both Cruz and Abbott and lost. He ran a close race, and everybody sort of applauds that. But he seemed just a little bit. He wasn't. I couldn't see how he was going to sell himself to Texas. I really didn't. But this guy, I could imagine, coming across well in Texas and maybe having a shot at unseating Cruz, who is, becoming increasingly unhinged as he falls deeper in with the MAGA crowd.
The unhingedness is at some point you have to hope that it kicks in, that people, sit up and take notice. A lot of people here are still going to vote conservative out of force of habit and lack of paying attention. And our media is terrible.
And the problem is, getting back to the subject of our conversation tonight, is that these people, it's almost like an article of religion for them to dismiss climate change and pretend that it's not happening. Or even if they acknowledge that it's happening, it's like, well, but we can't do anything about it because it would screw up the economy.
Yeah.
And it's like they kind of don't seem to get that this is a life or death situation.
Yeah, they're all for it until it impacts their bottom line.
Well, 20 years ago, there was a soft path out of this, and we should have taken it. And
yeah. Nobody was listening.
Yeah. And now we really got to slam on the brakes. And people who say you got to really slam on the brakes, 20 years ago they were crazy, and so now I sound like a crazy man. And that's part of it. It's like, the longer you wait, the more extreme what you have to do is going to be, and the more extreme the problems you're facing are going to be. It's still something. I mean, I'm kind of glad that I'm kind of old. It's still the bulk of it's still in the future, and we're causing the problems, and future generations are going to have to deal with it somehow. So, not what I hoped for my generation. Like I said, the age of Aquarius isn't really panning out the way it was sold to me.
Yeah, I think we lost track of the age of Aquarius some time ago.
Yeah.
We seem to have been on a very different trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So I look back and I think about things that were happening in the 50s and things that were happening in the 60s. And I realize, we're probably not worse off than we were back then, in some senses. I mean, in terms of the politics that we have. Well, no, I can't really say that. I almost wanted to say that the politics of today are not worse than they were in the 50s. And I was thinking about McCarthyism and that sort of thing.
Yep.
But that didn't have quite the distribution that this thing that's happening now has, this MAGA thing.
We're definitely at the threshold of new worsiness. Yep.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Either that or there's some reversal. I mean, pendulums do swing. Things can change.
Yes, and on the other hand, good intentions aren't enough. You have not only have to do the right thing, you have to do it right, and that's hard. That's a hard thing to do, and people have their enthusiasms and they'll pursue them.
Didn't somebody say the road to hell is paved with good intentions?
I think I might have heard that once.
Yeah.
So I'm not totally, confident that the pendulum swinging back to the left is going to fix everything. At this point, you have to hope for it because the pendulum swinging to the right has gotten to the point where it's just completely nuts.
Well, if it would just swing to the middle, I'd be okay.
Yeah, the problem with pendulums is that,
Pendulums
the way they
don't
work,
do
they
that.
swing one way, then they have to swing the other.
And they're always going to swing back. We're at the end of our hour.
Mm.
So thanks so much, Michael, for joining us. I actually think this was a
Never
great
gonna have
conversation.
Yeah, Michael, you have to come
Oh,
back.
absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm just so gloomy.
You're one of our best guests.
Oh well, thank you. That's kind of you to say, but I wish I could come up with better news.
Well,
We'll give you homework. You need to go out and find some good material there. You're in an interesting location.
Stand-up tragedy is my thing.
if you don't say alarming things, nobody will be alarmed.
Yeah,
You know?
I suppose at some point you have to stop mincing words.
Right on.
Yeah. Well,
Okay,
thank you
well.
so much for asking me, and I'll be happy to come on anytime. I enjoyed it.
Right on. This will be great. Thanks.
All right.
We will talk to you soon then.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Off we go. Bye-bye.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.